So I thought what I would do would just be reorient all of us to the question of Mortimer Adler. What is the book about? Where have we been? And then I think, since this is numbered 29, if that's anywhere near where we left off, and I'd sure appreciate it if somebody can tell me, the total number of chapters is 33. So we're not going to be meeting that long, and we'll have this thing over and have gotten through all the substantive chapters of the book. Okay? All right. It is said of one of the greatest university pedagogues that America ever produced, the late Dr. Mortimer Adler of the University of Chicago, that he was teaching one time, and like so many of us, at University of Chicago, during the time of Adler and Hutchins, the University of Chicago was a great books university. That is, your textbooks were a set of the great books. And the professors walked you through those primary sources for 4 years. That was your education at the University of Chicago during those years. One time, Dr. Adler was talking to a class who had just finished taking our equivalent of a Scantron exam. And he looked out at the class. They were going to make a transition to the next great book. And he looked at this young woman and said, "Miss Johnson, why don't we summarize what we did as we read John Locke's second treatise concerning human government, and from there I'd like to go to our next book, such and such." She had gotten 100 on the Scantron exam. And she looked back at him and said, I can't tell you what the book was about, and I can't summarize it." Well, what he realized was, given the type of testing that he was doing, multiple choice, multiple guess, true, false, and so forth, that it was possible to get 100 on that and yet not be able to say what the book was about. And he dropped those Scantrons forever that day. And his whole method of teaching after that changed to who wrote the book and what is it about? Sounds pretty fundamental, but the only reason we say that sort of thing is a lot because of Adler. He was the editor of the Great Books series from Encyclopedia Britannica. So, if we were to ask the question, what is this book about? The answer would be something like, it's a study of the deity and the humanity of Christ as it was being argued in that century and against particular other opinions or options. And as we went through the various chapters, and we went through all of them except for those chapters where he was demonstrating to his Roman Catholic opponents that this wasn't some new thing. The early Lutherans always had to cover for the charge that they were innovators. And some of those chapters I didn't outline because they were simply compilations of the great church fathers which confirmed what the Lutherans were saying and dated back to the 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries. So the book is about the person of Christ and his work on our behalf overall. Okay? In the early chapters, he argues using passages, lots of them, what we're fairly familiar with if we're in any branch of evangelical Christianity, that Jesus was truly God in human flesh. Passage, 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 passage. Any creedal Christian group should be saying amen to every one of them. Then he goes through what was almost lost in the earliest post-apostolic church, the real humanity of Christ, that he was genuinely a man. And those passages which he stacks up are the ones where we say, well, of course, Well, it isn't under fire as much in our century. What's under fire is his deity. But in the earliest years of Christianity, it was his humanity that was argued over, because you had all sorts of people who would grant just like that he was God, that he was man. And those passages are the ones that we just tend to go right past. Why? Well, conceived, born, suffered, died, so forth. Got hungry, got thirsty, tired, with the Samaritan woman, well, beat, needed rest, and so forth. Well, those were very important in the earliest years of Christianity, because that's what was being denied. It's hard for us to imagine. I try to imagine myself back into a fight on the other side, and I have to work at it, because I'm conditioned by our century of belittling the deity of Christ. But we just have to do what we can to imagine back. If you've read any church history, you know that this was under tremendous fire in the earliest years. Then he transitions to what both Dr. Horton and I call the hypostatic union. We use the same terminology, don't mean exactly the same thing, but we have the same terms. That is, how the deity and the humanity within the person of Christ were related. And the rest of the book fleshes out that, and this was written late enough, it certainly was directed against their Roman Catholic opponents, not a doubt about it, in detail. And what he's arguing there is, this is the sort of creedal stuff that one ought not fiddle with. The creeds make this, especially the Athanasian Creed, make it very clear there are some things that have to be affirmed. And he pushes that hypostatic union and the passages about him not being schizoid or split pretty hard. You remember the ancient heresy was Nestorianism. That is, he's truly God and he's truly man, and they were in watertight compartments, sealed off from one another. It was thrown out of the church as a heresy because what was getting lost was that he was one person, not schizophrenic, not a dual personality. So Chemnitz is pushing pretty hard on that, and for the most part, the Roman Catholics said, all right, we have no argument with you on this. Till it got to the supper, but we have no argument on that one. With the Calvinists, it was something else again. And that whole series of chapters, following the chapters on his real deity, his real humanity, and the introductory chapter on the hypostatic union, he drills down about 5 miles on the passages that have to do with that he was both and yet not a multi-personality. This was a singular personality, which is just creedal, but if Luther tended to the side of what is called the Eutychian heresy, and he did, he sort of tilted in that direction of that mistake, Calvin tilted in the direction of the Nestorian mistake, and Chemnitz goes after it. And he goes after it with passages. So we have gone through real detail on him not just being truly God, not just being truly man, but being one person, not a multi-personality, not schizoid. This is going to show up in the last chapters, the one Jim has passed out to you, whether he is to be worshipped according to both natures. Here, the Lutheran answer and the Reformed answer aren't the same. And when it goes to the supper, the roads divide. Mike just cannot understand why I can't just agree with that he's spiritually present. Now, probably Mike has read Chemnitz, but I haven't asked. But there's a linkage here between what's going on at the supper and all that we've plowed our way through here. I've told you through the various lectures. This is going to show up in the supper. One of the ways in which historic confessional Lutheran theology has been characterized is this. The center of the center of the center of the center of Lutheran theology is the communication of attributes within the person of Christ, and particularly the majestic genus, or the genus of majesty. That is, that in the one person, the singular person, not schizoid, in the one person, he shows forth his deity through his body. Says Chemnitz, for our sakes he healed by touch. We already know from the centurion passage he can heal with just saying the word. And the centurion knew that. I know if you just say the word, my daughter will live. Roman, non-Israelite. What we find here is, says Chemnitz, that there's a reason for us that he spit and made mud and put it on the blind guy's eyes. There's a reason he allowed the woman with the hemorrhage to be healed when she just touched part of his garment. And he wheeled around and said, somebody touched me. I felt power flow from me. Who touched me? Did he know? Absolutely, he knew. And Chemnitz says over and over and over and over again, it's linked with his body, just as all of his miracles testified to his deity, so also that he did these healings and often made use of his body to do it for our sakes, so that we wouldn't make him just spirit. Now you can see the linkage with the supper. Huh? This wine from Vaughn's actually was pretty good. I don't know if it's just Manischewitz, but it wasn't so awful this morning. Anyway. Anyway, this wine purchased at Ralph's, drink this, all of you, for the forgiveness of sins. All of that. Eat this for the forgiveness of sins. All of it is contingent on 20-some chapters of the deity and humanity of Christ and the hypostatic union and everything that he's built. Lutheran theology is the most empirical theology of all. That is, there is no split between the spiritual benefits and something going onto our tongues or into our mouths. One time Mike brought me another obscure Reformed confession and said, how about this? Would this be enough we could, together affirm? And I said, before I read it, Mike, just tell me what goes into my mouth. He said, well, bread and wine. I said, won't do. If that's what it's saying, all it took was the question, what goes into my mouth? And his answer was, well, bread and wine. Nope. All of this is what's behind that. And I've told you the story of the Westmont students. One wonderful young woman, never forget it, she was on the front row, looked at me as we were talking just before we started a section on sacraments, and bless her heart, she looked at me and said, but Professor Rosenblatt, you can't get spiritual benefits from material elements. And I said to her, actually, you're on my side on this. She said, no, you sound Roman Catholic. I said, no, you just haven't thought about it. You're with me on this. No. I said, yeah, you are. Let's think about it together. Have you bet all of the blue chips on particular blood shed on one particular cross out of one particular Jewish body one afternoon outside the city of Jerusalem? And she said, well, yes. I said, I told you, we're together on this. And somebody in the class said, yes, RH typable. And then somebody in my far left in the last, some guy said, yeah, it was universal donor. And I said, I'm going to remember that line forever. Yeah, it was universal donor. Okay? Here's what Chemnitz is getting to. And he realizes that there can be particular Christian centuries in which we're going to spiritualize. And it's our enemy, not our friend. Huh? That girl got it. And then we started in on whether water could grant the new birth and whether bread and wine could grant the forgiveness of sins. But the whole class sort of looked at it with furrowed brow and said, all right, let's hear the case. But she, bless her heart, spoke the key thing before we started. Well, you can't get spiritual benefits from matter. Okay? That's what, we're talking about. And same thing with baptism. Well, kids can't repent. They can't trust in Jesus. And you say, have you ever thought about it in terms of circumcision? The young Jewish boy became an inheritor of the Abrahamic promise through a very crude knife and a lot of pain. And he didn't say yes to Abraham. He couldn't think Abraham or say Abraham. 8 days old, and he's made an inheritor of the promise. This is a parallel to that. Of course they can't understand, but before you get too uppity, there are passages like John the Baptist in the womb, rejoicing when Mary comes close with Jesus within the womb. Don't get too uppity about fetuses and young kids. It could be that they trust better than we do. So a lot of things were shaking loose there with me teaching Intro to Doctrine at an evangelical college. Now, bless their hearts, they just let me do it. If I'd been at the Wheaton of the West, I probably wouldn't have done it. It was kind of gutsy on their part to do it. And they said, just go ahead. We know it's not going to be that you're a Baptist, but go ahead. Now, with InterVarsity, I had for years had all kinds of Christians, so I sort of taught in columns. Rome would say this, Luther would say this, Calvin would say this, Wesley would say this. And that was fine with InterVarsity, but it also worked at an evangelical college. So they had no idea who Chemnitz was, and in an undergraduate Intro to Doctrine course, at most I could maybe put it on a bibliography, but we didn't have time for that. It was basics. But this was what lies behind it. That there actually are cases to which the Lord himself directs us that have to do with matter saving. And every other type of Christian starts to hyperventilate at that. But it's the way it goes. It's just the way it goes. So in the closing chapters that you're going to read, he's going to push this to, in this instance, is it really right that we worship the humanity of Christ? Is that biblical or no? And there are a lot of Christians who'd say, well, no, we're worshiping his deity. And Chemnitz will have none of it. No. And the language of it is the language of whether by his resurrection he was given infinite gifts or finite gifts. And there's a lot packed into that. If he was given infinite gifts, again, after his humiliation was done, and he had conquered the grave, some of the ramifications are that Thomas worshiped the embodied risen Christ. Now, granted, he was doubtful, but he wanted to put his hand into Jesus' side, the wounds and his hands, but that's exactly what he's invited to do. And he falls on his face and says, my Lord and my God, after being invited to come and touch. Sure. Come here, Thomas. Put your hand into my side. Put your hand to my wounds and no longer be faithless but believing. And the high point of John's gospel, the culmination of it, is Thomas falling on his face saying, my Lord and my God. To the risen, still material, risen Christ. Okay? So there's a linkage here between the Christology and the view of the supper or baptism. They're linked. And many other Christians see this. They won't give the same answer you do, but they know they're linked. I never had to have the conversation with Mike Horton that behind our view of the supper is Christology, or behind our view of baptism is Christology. They know that. Give you one short example. Years ago, we were in Massachusetts, where Harvard is, and we had a gathering of seminary professors of all kinds to see who would sign to the solas of the Reformation. And we had people from Trinity, we had people from everywhere. Not liberal, they wouldn't bother, but those that tended to be conservative. And Mike had said to Jack Preuss, who was there as he was on the board, Jack had a suite that was assigned to him, and Mike had gone to him and said, can we use your suite for drinks after the sessions? And Jack said, sure, absolutely, come on up. I was late getting to that. I walked into the room, and I saw the St. Louis profs around the edge of the room, sort of looking like, what's Rosenblatt gotten us into here? He's a little weird to begin with. They were sort of eyeballing it from afar. The Fort Wayne guys, I found, all were clustered around Horton, everybody with a drink in his hand. And what was the subject? Christology. And I walked in, Mike looked over and smiled at me, surrounded by 6 Fort Wayne profs, and he said, we're talking about Christology, Rod. You probably would love this, watching this. 6 against 1. But that they all realize it's your Christology out of which your view of the sacraments comes, or doesn't. So what Chemnitz is going to argue in the last few chapters is, he is worthy to be worshipped according to his deity and his humanity. And at the supper, you receive the forgiveness of sins through relatively cheap wine and bread of some kind. And that's the way it is. The whole book's been headed for this. And we'll see this in the last chapters. That this actually is the way it is. All of the 300 pages that preceded were to do this there at the end. So, okay, that's the plot line of the book. That's the what do they call it in drama? The plot line, or the story of the book. And we'll finish this, I think, in fewer than 6 Sundays, and we'll be done. But it's worthy of finishing because some of these chapters are what it's been leading to, and it will have a lot to do with your conversation with others like that young girl at Westmont who've never heard such a thing, and it sounds weird, Roman or worse, weird. If you were to take a wide survey through evangelical Christianity and you said, what are the aids that God has given to us to aid us in the fight as we head toward the grave and to help us to keep believing in Jesus? And what would the evangelical list? Huh? The Word, absolutely. The preaching of the gospel, absolutely.
The walk.
What?
The walk.
Yeah, the walk, the Holy Spirit gearing you toward the fight and providing for you in the fight, absolutely.
Making sure you have more and better quiet times.
Yes, certainly that devotional hour, a lot rests on it because there are no sacraments. Fellowship, koinonia, teachers who will build you up in the faith, I mean, there's a whole list. And the classical Lutheran goes, baptism? And the whole room goes, who is that? The supper? Who is that guy? You know, and then we'll have some of those others. But yeah, they cock their head like, what does that have to do with anything? Because they're not sacraments, they're ordinances. You bring yourself to be baptized. Huh? You bring yourself to the supper. As Pastor was saying this morning, we're not the subject here. Christ is. Huh? It's not about us coming. It's about him dying and then giving the benefits to us, and he does it through matter. Okay? All right. So that's where we're going in the last weeks. Take a look at what we've just passed out, and then if some of you can take a look back through what I've passed out and sort of orient me to what did we do last. I've pretty much finished the book in outline form, and I had sent some ahead to Jan. I was kind of ahead of the game by the time graduation occurred in May, but I want to make sure that your collection's complete and that we've had at least some time together to do each chapter so that the course really we've had some time to do each key chapter, especially here at the end, because it's where he's been headed. Okay, questions or comments? Robert?
Do they feel that when the elements are consecrated,
Who's they?
the evangelicals,
Okay.
the Calvinists, do they feel that nothing happens? Is there just, in other words, even though we're using the same words that Christ taught us to
They
use,
might use the words of institution, they might not. I rejoice every time that they're used, but you can't count on it.
They would just say there would be no confession absolution, and then they would say before the cup and the plate was passed around, they would say, if you have any unconfessed sin or anything like that, that please let this pass. And so here you are sitting in the service, and this happened to me
And
many
seeing
times.
the tray
You
coming
would sit there
down
and I
toward
would
you.
go, well, what's this guy going to think? You know, if I don't take it.
Yep.
And so it would
Yep.
make you feel unworthy to take it. And what's the supper for?
Yeah.
Sinners. And
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it would drive me nuts, just absolutely nuts, if I had to be qualified to come other than by my sin, because no matter where you slice the salami, I don't qualify. And that's a very real thing to many evangelicals. Am I making matters worse? And I might be. Terrifying.
Well, one of the things that Jeremy brought up several weeks ago is, you know, if this really doesn't mean anything, why should we worry about it?
I'll say to Ken, my Baptist co-host, why do you care how much water there is when it doesn't do anything?
And what does he say?
There is nothing to say that. One time Ken said to me when the microphones were off, he said, if I had you substitute for me in Compton, would you baptize every infant in there? I said, absolutely. He said, I knew it. I knew it.
Rod, the one word that I've heard substituted, one word. It's the word they use is symbolize.
Uh-huh.
The big church on the hill, that's the word they use.
Mm-hmm. That was Luther, in regard to the supper, that was Luther versus Zwingli. The town was Marburg, and they hashed it out there, and Luther used the Greek and got his hands around Zwingli's throat with the Greek, and he finally cried uncle and said, all right, is can't mean symbolizes. Then he switched to philosophy. He said, is can't mean symbolize, but there's still not the real presence of Christ in the supper. And Luther said, what? He said, well, the finite is incapable of the infinite. Luther was ballistic. He said, if this was about philosophy, why didn't you have the balls to tell me so before I got here? Well, that's a rough translation. Okay? That was what was being argued, was exactly that. Yeah.
Rod, you made the comment that we don't derive spiritual benefit from matter.
That's
Yet
most evangelicals.
Don't we, as Lutherans, confess that we do receive bread and wine, but the body and blood are in, with, and under? Is that the terminology that we use?
That's the phrase we usually use. But they'll never go there. That's too Roman. Passing the bread to them, he said, "Eat of this. This is my body, given into death for you and for your sin." And giving them the cup after blessing it, he said, "Drink of this, all of you. This blood is the covenant, the new covenant in the New Testament in my blood, shed for you for the forgiveness of sins. Drink." And Luther was on that, and many times he didn't even go to 1 Corinthians.
So we as Lutherans do confess that we do receive spiritual
Yeah.
benefit from matter.
Yeah,
That's what I'm looking for.
and we do it just in spades. And most other evangelicals by this time are on the sidelines wishing us well, but saying those people are weird and spooky. Yeah,
And wondering whether we're saved or not.
yeah, yeah. Craig Barton said Lutherans, they're the ones that are the mission field when he was with Crusade.
One thing I'm reminded of when you talk about this is there's so many different levels to the importance of this distinction that's made in this book, because I think in our spiritual life, our interpersonal life, and in our work life, if we contain any kind of dualism in the way we look at matter versus spiritual things, it affects everything we do.
It really does.
You know? And if you don't have a clear understanding of the goodness of the material,
Yep.
along with God's
Yep.
goodness,
Yep.
you wind up making decisions one after the other that actually leave you in limbo because you're not sure what your position is.
Yeah.
And the only thing you're looking for, which is ironic, I think, in our American system of, making a living, is that we look at our financial material reward as the reward that God has given us if we've done things right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that doesn't fit the dualism that is taught to the evangelical and the Calvinist to start with, which is ironic.
Yeah, it is ironic. When we start talking about the doctrine of vocation, Uwe and Gene Veith, we're in it again, because the evangelical wants to know what your ministry is. And you say, well, I work at Boeing and I try to design a wing that'll get people safely to O'Hare in Chicago. And he says, well, that's great, that pays the mortgage, but I was asking about your ministry. Same thing. God has called me to be an aeronautical engineer and design wings. That's what he's called me to do. You could call it a ministry even, and the evangelicals start to hyperventilate. What kind of... Who are you people? Yeah.
Yeah, can I go back to when you mentioned that they use John 6 as some sort of an argument? Am I not right that comes after John 5, which is the feeding of the 5,000?
Yes, it is.
And so Jesus the next day is saying to them,
you came because you got your bellies full.
right, you're coming back for another meal. Unless you eat my body, drink my blood,
Yep.
you
Yep,
have nothing to
that's
do
it.
with me.
What Dr. Godfrey calls Jesus' church shrinkage sermon.
Yeah. But I mean, how could they use that as an evidence that because without the context that we have of the Last Supper, that sounds crazy. But in the context that we use, it makes perfect sense. So
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. It just, and they can't understand why we won't soften on this. We're both affirming the spiritual presence of Christ, and the Lutheran goes, that's not enough. And they go, why is that not enough? Because that's their complete confession. Asked Mike Boucher one time, he came up with, Zwingli's easy. It's what you have at every evangelical congregation. You're remembering gratefully Christ dying for you and trying to thank him adequately for it. Calvin's not so easy. Mike Boucher, convert from Calvary Chapel, calls it the elevator theory. Jesus, because he has a body, can't be in more than one place at one time because he has a real human body, even risen from the dead. He's got a body. Huh? And so what the Reformed do with that is to say, well, because he's truly man, he can't be in more than one place at one time. You, however, can. You're at the Reformed church taking the wine and the bread, and in the instant you take it, you rise to where Christ is, and it's a location, and there, not with your mouth, feast on the true body and blood of Christ by faith alone. So you can be in more than one place at one time. He can't. Mike called it the elevator theory, and finally I said, he's got it. He's got it. Jesus can't be in more than one place at one time because he has a body, but we can. So Calvin, Calvin was almost incapable of writing things that were unclear, but in this case, you find unclarity upon unclarity. Why? Because he didn't want to burn the bridge with the Lutherans. So he was purposely writing obscurely because he didn't want to lose the Lutherans. He did anyway, but he knew if I go where I'm going here, they're out. And he didn't want that to happen. But there's no way a Lutheran's going to sign something like that. There's no way. Anyway, you get the idea. All right, one more.
I think, too, what's involved is linkage with the Old Testament miracles that are Christ in the material world. The walking through the Red Sea, the striking of the rock for the water, the serpent on the brass pole. These are all Christ. If you accept those, why can you not accept the miracle that we experience today?
All of it, in many cases, there's a very simple answer to that. And it almost jars you when you hear it. They set by faith alone against matter. A good Baptist will say, you guys are the beginnings of faith alone saves. And we say, yeah, that's true. And we'll go to the wall for it. Well, as soon as you add supper, you're Rome. Faith alone isn't enough. And we go, it's the same gospel, only this time he gives it to you in matter. But it's the same gospel. Here, let me give you, again, Christ and his benefits. It's not against faith alone. It's the same message. Only this way, it's coming through a different... And every Baptist will go, you guys, I thought believed in faith alone, but you don't. You've added water and wine and bread. You don't believe faith alone. That's their training. That's their training. Okay, enough for the morning.